particular. So I decided not to do AS level things. So you can ask me afterwards if you are interested in, because that's, to some degree, it's a very fascinating topic and very recent results that indicate how little we know about that world of the AS. What I try to sort of focus on is, and I will be a little bit brief here in terms of the first part, because I want to focus more on the measurement side, because I think you haven't sort of seen too much on the measurement side. And so I will go through quickly through the first piece and then hopefully get to the second piece. The first piece is basically a repeat of what you already discussed before. And again, if you have questions as I go along, please feel free to interrupt. This should be a little interactive. Let me first start. So you all know about Achilles, where the story comes from. So Achilles, when he was a baby, was foretold to die in battle when he grows up, and his mother got all scared, and there was one solution that she found out, and that is she had to dip his body into the water of the river Styx. Of course, she has to grab on somewhere, and she grabbed on the heel. And sure enough, over the course of the time, I mean, he became a very famous warrior. But at the end, he was killed in battle by a poisonous arrow that hit precisely his heel. So that's sort of the whole story about Achilles heel. And if you Google Achilles heel, I mean, you find Achilles heels for everything. So in particular, it's known to, has become known, deadly weakness in spite of overall strength. So that's little history where this comes from. And then, of course, so we are here at this point where in 2000, this story became very popular. The internet has an Achilles heel. And again, what is the Achilles heel of the internet? Very briefly, this is sort of a cartoon of the internet in terms of these nodes are the routers. The red ones are the highly connected. The green ones are the less connected, and the blue and the gray ones are the least connected. You see that the red ones and the blue ones are sort of in the middle of the network. And so if you attack one of these red ones or nuke it, what happens is the worst thing that sort of happens to the internet, it partitions into segments. And if you think of the most valuable aspect of the internet is that it connects billions of people nowadays. Making it disconnect and partitioning it into separate pieces that cannot talk to one another is sort of the worst thing that you can do to the internet. And so this story became very popular in 2000 and from there on. And if you look into books, in various books, this is sold as a fact about the internet. The longer story is even a little more complicated because it starts so appealing in terms of there have been measurements out there. People have analyzed these measurements and found that these measurements indicate that the internet has something which we talked about before in power law. And to me, the simple translation of what is power law is most nodes have degree 1 or 2. And on the other hand, you have a few nodes that have degrees 1,000 and maybe even 10,000. So it's an extremely skewed distribution. If you compare that to a normal distribution where almost all nodes would have sort of the degree corresponding to a mean, then you would, in a normal distribution, you wouldn't find anything that's sort of 2, 3, 4 standard deviations from the mean. You would never see, if the mean is 0, you would never see degrees of 1,000, even 100. But these power laws have these notions. So, and then none of the existing models of graphs could capture this power law behavior. So there was need for new mathematical models, which are these scale-free models. They were analyzed and found to have very strong properties. In particular, if you want to attack such a scale-free graph, the best thing to do is to focus on these high-degree nodes that are in the middle of the network. You attack them and the network partitions. And then if you are interested in other aspects of, if you have a virus that propagates on such a graph, these graph structures are the worst possible scenarios because as soon as a virus hits this graph and then hits one of the highly connected nodes, the network is dead. So when you go back to the internet, you apply these findings, so the empirical finding, the mathematical modeling and its properties, you apply it to internet. The conclusion was the internet has this bad property. And so this created considerable excitement in various areas, but the networking people looked at it and said, this is sort of nonsense. Where are the issues and where are the problems? And so I just want to go very quickly through this aspect, and that basically say, how would you go about building the physical infrastructure of a network, of an internet service provider? And what would you have to consider in order to build it, and what would come out of it? And then I want to switch over to the measurement aspect and sort of indicate why these measurements that people have been looking at are actually completely inappropriate for this purpose. So how would we build the physical network of an internet service provider? So you're an internet service provider, let's say, that serves the United States or a region in it. What's the point of building it? So the first question you have to ask yourself is, what's the reason to build this network or to operate it? So what should be its functionality? Anybody has a sort of a quick solution or a quick answer to this? So what should be the purpose of a network? So you have these end users there. All that you want to do is to connect the end users to the internet. Okay. So what kind of end users are out there? So if you plot sort of speed that the end user uses and the number of such end users that use a particular speed. So what we have is typically we have a few end users. These are these big enterprises, the huge customers that need very high speed, up to maybe 40 gigabits per second connectivity to the internet. Then you have medium-sized customers that you want to serve in your area. Maybe 100 megabits per second is a little bit low, but that's maybe one limit. But then you have all these end users that you have. So you yourself at home, you want to be connected. You want to be served by that, or this ISP wants to serve you. And so there you have, I mean, we don't do anymore this stuff here, the dial-ups, but you still have customers that want dial-ups. But you get to end broadband, cable, DSL speeds, and so you have all these kind of customers out there that have these varieties of different bandwidth demands, and you want to serve them. And as I said, a few of them you will have this will require the high demand, the high bandwidth, and many of them will require the low bandwidth. And so you want to serve this spectrum of end users. And now the question is really an economic question. Where do you get most of the money? And it's a trade-off. So the high-end customers will pay a lot to get connected because they need a big pipe. The middle ones are medium-sized, and then you have the little guys, ourselves, they will pay $30. But you have many of them. So as an ISP, you have to serve this clientele, and you know what you get from them in terms of money. And you know how many of them are in that region that you want to serve. So the question is then really, how do you want to build a network that does this job well? Because you want to make profit, ideally. So that's one aspect that an ISP sits there and says, this is what I want to do, and this is what I'm faced with in terms of who I want to serve. Then the next thing is, I need to build this network using physical hardware. These are the routers. So anybody have seen a router? I thought I bring with me an interface card, but it's too heavy, so I didn't bring it with me. So I have some pictures. So most of you have seen a router, and you have seen this one. This is the wireless router. This is not what we are talking about. What we are talking about is these kind of things, which so these are maybe this high, all the way from this height, home sized. And if you look carefully, these guys have lots of interface cards here so this is a typical piece for dial-up customers. So there are like probably 1,000 dial-up customers that you can plug in here. And then as you go to the bigger pieces, it's not for dial-up customers, but for high-speed customers. This has been the piece that has been sitting there for the last couple of years, very, quite expensive, about, almost $1 million if you buy it fully loaded. And this is the latest piece that Cisco offers, and this is, if you buy it fully loaded, it's probably between $5 and $10 million. So, but this is total capacity here is about 300 terabits per second. So this is a huge capacity that, and this is like 2 terabits, and then here are gigabits per second. So here, this is what you are faced with if you try to go out and build a network in terms of the hardware. You go to Cisco, Juniper, whatever, and they will give you all this, equipment. And what you see is that they have different equipment for different purposes. Again, so as I said, I mean, these guys you wouldn't put into a network where you want to connect these high-speed links. This is this stuff you put into the edge of the network. It's these expensive pieces that you want to put in the middle of the network because they have this highest capacity. But they are also the most expensive one. So if you buy the most expensive pieces, you also want to use it in a most efficient way. You don't want to use it in an inefficient way. So in terms of how much does a router cost, it depends on the size and its functionality. And then the question is now, so how does an ISP now who wants to serve these end users make use of this technology to achieve its purpose? And so here it's very relatively simple, the choice that the ISP has to do. But one thing to keep in mind is that these things change over years. So in 2000, the most expensive router you could buy was a couple of 100 megabits per second in terms of total capacity. And you could sort of connect maybe 10 high-speed connections there. In 2005, this moved up in terms of total capacity and also in terms of how many interface cards you could populate. And today we are up there. But the picture is always the same. It just moves up in terms of the technology advances. And as I said, today the most expensive piece of equipment that Cisco or the other router vendors sell you give you capacities of a couple of hundreds of terabytes per second. But still, even with that equipment, you can maybe connect a couple of tens of very high-speed links, or you can go to higher degrees, but then you take a hit in performance, but you can connect sort of lower speed links with that expensive equipment. But the network, the ISP certainly wouldn't do that, because then you use this very expensive equipment in a not very efficient way. Okay. So if you now look at what the whole service offering of a vendor like Cisco does, if you have particular technology up there on top, that's very expensive. That's the core technology. Then you always have old pieces of equipment sitting in a network. And then on the right-hand side, you have this cheap equipment that lets you connect all these little customers that don't require much bandwidth. Okay. But that's the only technology where you can get degrees up to a couple of thousand. And that's just by the technology dictates that it has to sit at the edge of the network where you bring all these little customers together. Oh, yes. Okay, so then, how does an ISP deploy these routers? The idea is to put this cheap equipment at the edge and bring the traffic from the edge to the core, and then use in the core this expensive equipment because you have all this traffic to deal with. So then if you have that picture, then you very quickly end up with a design principle for designing a physical network for an ISP that's very simplistically viewed as a constraint optimization problem. If you only have one router, you have to keep the router within this technology feasible region, in terms of you cannot have more capacity or higher degree. What you don't know about is exactly this demand that these various users provide. So you have to put in some model, and if you have a particular knowledge about these end user demands that your customers or your likely customers will put on the network, you will put that in your model. And then what your goal is really to build this network using this technology and this demand in such a way that you can push as much traffic through that network as possible. because that sort of relates to you want to make profit when you build this network. So now you have this formulation of a network design problem as a, and you view this problem now really as a technological, social in terms of the traffic, and then economical problem, and it's not very complicated. And in this whole process, this notion of power law doesn't even come up, because technology and economics are the only drivers to build this network. So if you have this constraint optimization problem, you don't even have to go for the optimal solution. You just go for a heuristic solution, and the heuristic very simply tells you, put this expensive equipment in the core. That gives you immediately a mesh of low degree nodes but very high capacity nodes, and then put the cheap equipment that lets you connect lots and lots of low bandwidth customers at the edge. And that's exactly how people build a network. So if you look at one example of a network that everybody here could have access to if they want to, well, okay, so here is just an outcome of such a design. Here is Internet 2, Abilene or Internet 2. So this is an education research network in the US. You can go to the website and they tell you everything about that network. So it has about 11 or 12 nodes, backbone nodes, and that's being fed by all the customers of these networks. You look at this network and it is essentially not very different from what we just designed. And again, power laws don't even come up in this context. Okay, so this is how you would design a network. You have technology, you have economic constraint. These are the two pieces that dictate everything. And in particular, what you don't do is, if you have two routers, you do not toss a coin to decide whether you connect the two routers. This is driven by economics, not by randomness. So let me switch now to, now you have a network. Now you're asked as a researcher or as a student or whatever, go and map this network. So it's a network of AT&T. You don't know the physical infrastructure. How do you go about figuring out what is that physical infrastructure of AT&T's network? So if you go back to this one, this network is out there. I told you this is sort of unusual because you can go to the websites of Internet 2 and they tell you the connectivity. They tell you this physical infrastructure. In general, networks or ISPs don't do that. But so suppose now they don't tell you, and you are given the task of mapping that network as I show it to you, in terms of give me these orange nodes and links that make up this network. How would you go about doing that? So anybody has heard about traceroute? Is that some tool that's familiar or not? Anybody use traceroute? Nobody used traceroute, okay. So traceroute is a tool that you can use on your laptop. If you're connected to the Princeton network, you can execute something that says traceroute to a particular destination, and what traceroute gives you is the intermediate routers. So here's a little, so this is what traceroute is. Note this one, the reported IP addresses are not the routers' IP addresses, but the routers of the interfaces. So I showed you these routers, and they have lots of interface cards. Each one of these interface cards have an IP address. This is what the traceroute gives you. So if I do a little, what I did here is, so I did traceroute from my machine in Florham Park to Princeton. And this is a typical traceroute probe that if you run it, you get. So if you do it from Princeton to whatever, you would see something similar here and then whatever at the edge. But this one is basically telling you my traceroute probe that I ran from Florham Park to Princeton went through AT&T's network and hit a bunch of different routers along the way. Here it ends up in New York and then goes to Washington, D.C., and then comes back to Virginia somewhere, and then it hits this network. This is the provider of Princeton, okay, which is called Patek Net, which has been bought recently by some other company. So I don't remember what the name is. But this traceroute probe goes through the AT&T network, hits now this network that serves Princeton, and then ends up in Princeton. So now this is a traceroute probe that gives you the IP addresses of each one of the interface cards of the routers through which this probe went from Florham Park to Princeton. So now if you would imagine the experiment that you have like 30 people here, suppose you live in all different places around the US, and now you do trace routes from one to another. And you try to map a particular network like AT&T's network or Internet 2. So this would be something like this, and the idea is basically if you have enough machines at the edge, and if you do enough cross trace routes, you would basically be able to recover the infrastructure of this network, because you would ultimately, a probe will get through every router one way or the other. That's the idea. And so people have been doing these measurements for many, many years, more than 20 years. And there are hundreds of millions of such traceroute probes that people use. And this finding of the Internet being having power law is based on these traceroute probes. Now the big question, can we trust traceroute? So what happens if you do traceroute of this simple network? So this is Internet 2, just simplified in terms of just the backbone. Okay, it's about 11 or 12 nodes, very small number of links. Now you do traceroute of this simple network. What happens is a picture that this is what you get. Okay, this doesn't look anything like this one. And there is one simple reason, and the simple reason is this one. So as I told you, a router can have multiple interface cards. Okay? If you don't know that these two interface cards, 1 and 2, are sitting on the same router, you cannot take this mapping and map it into this. All you get is this mess here. And for many, for the last 2 decades, we have, the network researchers have found no generic way to do this mapping from interface cards to routers. And so this mess here is basically a result of the fact that these high-speed backbone routers in Internet 2 have about a couple of tens of interface cards, and the traceroute thinks that each one of these interface cards is an individual router, which is not the case. And we cannot, and there is no generic method to map the interface card to the right router. So I showed you the picture of a router. It has maybe 20 interface cards. We have no way to map these IP addresses of these interface cards to that one router. That's the problem. So then if you, for example, do node degree distribution of this network and this network, you shouldn't be surprised that you get something very different. The real network is this purple one, and the one that you just inferred from all the trace routes is the one with the yellow ones. So it's 2 very different things. And here's another little problem that also causes significant problems. So here is a network called Level 3, one of the biggest IP transit providers in the world. I just show you the US portion of the network. And just concentrate on the green and red nodes. Okay. If I do traceroute of this, so people did traceroute trying to map this network, and they get this mess. So again, this network with the red nodes and the green and red links is nothing compared to this one. It's just day and night. So what's happening here? The problem here, so if this is the physical infrastructure of this level 3 network with all its routers, this network has decided to use a particular traffic management technique called MPLS, which is multi-label protocol switching. And that basically says that if a traceroute packet, for example, hits this router, you will only see that packet again when it comes out of the network and leaves the network. and you will see nothing, you won't get any information about the inside of this network. Okay? So if you go back here, so what you see is any traceroute packet that came to level 3 in Florida, in one hop ends up in all the other ones. And you don't see anything in the middle. Okay? So it's like a fully meshed network that is only a result of the appearance of the presence of a particular protocol that runs on that network. It has nothing, this traceroute picture says nothing about the physical infrastructure of the network itself. So we have 3 pieces that, if you put them together, tells you that these measurements are completely inappropriate for using and mapping a network. So the first one is, it's a technique that hasn't been designed to map a network. It has been designed for other purposes. It has the node degrees themselves, so the values that we get, you cannot trust because of this problem that we cannot map interface IP addresses to routers. The high degree nodes that this technique gives you are fake because they are a result of other protocols that run on top of it. And then the last piece is that if there are actual high degree nodes in this network, in the first part of my talk I told you they have to be at the edge of the network. Okay? But if you do traceroute experiments, you will never be able to get to those end nodes because you won't have enough machines in that area. I mean, you would have to be unbelievably lucky to be able to have a high degree nodes at the edge of the network and that you have hundreds of machines in that particular part of the network from which you can do trace routing. And none of these experiments that people did have that. So if there are high degree nodes, this technique doesn't show it. The high degree nodes that the technique gives you are not are fake. So this is the problem with the measurements. And then if you go back and close the loop here, what would be if we could trust this data? Well, then we go through this spiel that says, okay, then you have these power laws, so you produce a model, the model has certain features, and now, if you have these features, you compare them and you see that for one and the same power law, let's say this is a power law, you get two very different networks. The left-hand side is the one that we designed. The right-hand side is where you throw coins in the preferential attachment way. And then if you compare these two models with respect to any kind of properties that you're interested in, then you find that these networks are completely different. So they are drastically different. Okay. And so let me get back, so finish up with one question here. So in terms of performance, Mang already showed you, the network that we designed has high performance because we designed it that way. Okay. These random networks, of course, have low performance, and these bottlenecks are obvious when you look at them. In terms of this fragility, so if you remove one of these routers in the core of the network, not much is happening because there is redundancy built in. If you remove one of these high degree nodes at the edge, the only thing that happens is that the users that connect to that edge are affected. Everything else is fine. So that's no problem. Now, so this is not the Achilles heel of the internet, that you remove a high degree node. Absolutely no problem. What is the real Achilles heel of the internet, if it has one? So the real Achilles heel is really you hijack the network. And the way you basically think about it in terms of biology, immune system. It's exactly the same thing. So what's the amazing thing that cancer is doing? It uses the body's immune system for its own purpose. Or it misuses it, but it uses it. The hijacking is exactly the same thing. If you hijack the network, you make use of the network in terms of the connectivity that it provides you with, but you make use of it for your own malicious purpose. So you want to tweak a particular protocol, routing protocol, for example, in such a way that traffic cannot go from one place to another. That's, you tweak the protocol, but you make use of the very infrastructure that you want to actually attack. And that's the biggest Achilles heel of the internet. So it has nothing to do with physically attacking a piece of equipment in the network. That's nonsense. The big problem is really this protocol dependence. Okay, finally, the last 3 points. So even if we could trust the data, so there is this aspect of for one and the same node degree distribution, you can have many different networks which drastically differ properties. Some are clearly wrong, some are more or less correct. And then the final piece is really, what I showed you is an idea here that when it comes to technological network modeling should not be data fitting. So here is a node degree distribution, and then you try to find a model that fits that node degree. But it should be an exercise in what we call reverse engineering. So here is a network out there that does something. You are asking the question, what is this network? What is its functionality? And that's the first question. And from there on, you end up with the first thing that I showed you. If the functionality is to serve a certain user base, then it's an economic problem and a technology problem, and that dictates how you design the network. All right. So I don't talk about AS level topology because that's not anymore part of it, but as I said, that's sort of a very different aspect of internet connectivity, but it has the same two key pieces in terms of the measurements that have been used are completely unreliable and inappropriate. And then the opposite side, if you ask the functionality of this AS level network, it's an economic issue, and you have to think of it in terms of economics and not in terms of power or anything else.